It wasn't all that long ago that if you were out in your local city, town or village on the run-up to November the 5th, you would very likely have heard children, quite often young lads, calling out the phrase, "penny for the guy." Sat beside them on the ground, on a chair, or quite often in a wheelbarrow or handmade cart, would be a curious-looking chap. Made from Dad's old shirts, jumpers, trousers and the like, he'd be stuffed with straw, old newspaper or rags. His face would rarely look the same, the kids having used any number of different masks or painted facial expressions. The parading and displaying of this funny-looking fellow would, they hoped, fill their pockets with money, which they would then go and buy fireworks with. When night fell on November the 5th, the fate of this guy they had created would be sealed as they placed him on a stack of wood and broken furniture and set fire to it. The guy would burn until there was nothing left. Until next year. Now, I expect many of you watching this will remember hearing that call and seeing those kids with their guy. Some of you may have even been those kids. I remember quite well lads standing in the market square in my hometown with their ragged guys and asking passers-by for pennies. And I'm sure in some places this tradition still lives on, though I will admit I haven't seen it for a good many years. Nowadays, Halloween and trick-or-treat seems to have mostly overshadowed and replaced penny for the guy. But what are the origins of this tradition, and who even is the guy meant to represent? In the UK, but most commonly in England, it's highly unlikely that you would not be familiar with Bonfire Night or Firework Night, an event that happens on or around the 5th of November every year. This event was once called Guy Fawkes Night, and in some places it probably still is. But for the most part now, this yearly celebration with its bonfires, fireworks, fun fairs and entertainment has mostly left behind its dark historical roots. The real Guy, the fellow that those old effigies were meant to represent, was a real person. And his name was, yes, you've guessed it, Guy Fawkes. And over 400 years ago, he became part of one of the most infamous plots in British history. The year was 1605, and tensions between England's Protestants and Catholics were high. A small group of Catholic conspirators, frustrated and angered by the ongoing and severe persecution of their faith under the rule of King James I, decided to take matters into their own hands. Their plan, as many of us know, was to blow up the Houses of Parliament. This was meant to happen during its opening ceremony, killing the king, his government, and anyone else inside, and in the chaos that followed, to restore a Catholic monarch to the throne. Guy Fawkes was the man chosen among them to guard the barrels of gunpowder hidden deep beneath Parliament. But, as the historical accounts tell us, the plot was uncovered at the very last moment. An anonymous letter was sent to a Catholic lord due to attend Parliament that day, and Guy Fawkes was discovered, arrested, and tried for high treason. The king had survived, and the people rejoiced, and it's said that they lit bonfires in celebration. Now, whilst I was researching this, I came across a number of claims about when the first bonfires started. One of those claims was that the king himself proclaimed that bonfires should be lit in celebration. However, I was unable to find any historical document supporting that. What James did do, however, in January of 1606, was to declare an annual day of deliverance for the 5th of November. And from then on, it wasn't just another day. Every parish, every chapel across England and Wales was to hold a special service of thanksgiving, offering praise to Almighty God for sparing the realm from destruction. Attendance wasn't optional either, although it prescribed no penalties for absence. But everyone was expected to show up, orderly and sober, to give thanks and remember. And just to make sure no one forgets, ministers are required to give a public reminder the Sunday before, and on the day itself, read the very words of this act aloud. Another claim that I came across was that the people themselves spontaneously lit bonfires in celebration that this plot had been foiled, and I think this is probably more likely to be the case, although I've still not been able to find anything reliable to corroborate this. So, my fellow history sleuths, if you know where I can find it, do not hesitate to share it below. But there is evidence of bonfires being lit in celebration prior to November the 5th, 1605. In 1586, when Mary Queen of Scots was found guilty of conspiring to assassinate Queen Elizabeth and take the throne of England, under ongoing pressure from Parliament, Elizabeth finally agreed to the sentence of death for Mary. 4 days later, this was proclaimed in public, and the people celebrated with the ringing of bells, making of bonfires, and the singing of psalms. And let's not forget what time of year it was. Whilst news spread of the Gunpowder Plot during the day and into the night, it's very likely people would have moved around to tell those they knew, and many would have congregated outside. It's cold in November, so they would have lit fires to keep themselves warm. So there is a practical element to this too. But what about the burning of the Guy? Well, like me, you'd probably assume that Guy Fawkes himself was burnt at the stake for his treason. But he wasn't. That particular death sentence at the time was for those found guilty of heresy, not for those found guilty of high treason. Guy Fawkes and the other men found guilty with him were sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered. And that's exactly what happened to most of them, except for Guy himself, who actually managed to evade most of the horrific execution planned for him. He climbed the gallows with the noose around his neck and jumped to a broken neck and ultimately his swift death. His body was still quartered, though, and sent to the four corners of the kingdom. So if the execution of Guy Fawkes didn't inspire the burning of the effigy, what did? Well, even before the Gunpowder Plot, there was another tradition known as Jack-o'-lent. Jack-o'-lent was an English custom where a rag and straw effigy was paraded, pelted and mocked. In some cases, it's also recorded that it was thrown on a fire. This happened during Lent, often on Palm Sunday. Sometimes seen as a stand-in for Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus, it acted as a scapegoat figure the community could punish before Easter. Even Shakespeare mentions the Jack-o'-lent in his play, The Merry Wives of Windsor. After the Gunpowder Plot, the accounts of burning effigies were much easier to find. In 1679, Charles II was king, but he had no children, and therefore his brother, James the Duke of York, was heir to the throne. However, England was mostly Protestant, and James had converted to Rome in recent years. So when news started to spread of a plot to overthrow Charles and place his Catholic brother on the throne, there was much panic amongst the Protestant people. They greatly feared a return to rule under a Roman Catholic monarch. This plot, however, turned out to be fabricated. But whilst the rumours were circulating, it caused a great deal of unrest. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth I on November the 17th, 120 years earlier, was still an annual celebration at this time. Elizabeth was greatly loved amongst the Protestant population, who saw her as the ruler who saved England from Catholic tyranny. But, under threat of a Catholic king, these yearly celebrations were very much kicked up a notch. In London, on the anniversary of her coronation in 1679, the most notorious of these processions is said to have taken place. Ginormous effigies of figures representing various hierarchies within the Roman Catholic Church were apparently paraded through the streets. The most extravagant of them all was, of course, the Pope. The devil was also represented, although it's said he was played by a young lad dashing in between these figures and whispering to them. These effigies were then thrown on a huge bonfire, whilst the devil, the young lad, laughed. With this unsettling display, these Protestants made it quite clear how they felt about the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, and the threat hanging over their heads. In the century that followed, during Queen Anne's reign between 1702 and 1714, these parades were said to have continued. But now there was another effigy joining the condemned. That of the pretender, James Francis Edward Stuart, Catholic claimant to the throne. On a somewhat lighter note, another account I found of effigies was one from East Kent in 1779. In the Gentleman's Magazine on February the 16th, the author writes, "Being on a visit on Tuesday last in a little obscure village in this county, I found an odd kind of sport going forward. The girls, from 18 to 5 or 6 years old, were assembled in a crowd, and burning an uncouth effigy, which they called a holly boy, and which it seems they had stolen from the boys, who, in another part of the village, were assembled together and burning what they called an ivy girl, which they had stolen from the girls. All this ceremony was accompanied with loud huzzas, noise and acclamations. What it all means I cannot tell, although I inquired of several of the oldest people in the place, who could only answer that it had always been a sport at this season of the year." The first mention I found of children asking for money for the Guy was in a book on British traditions published in 1771. The author John Brand writes this: "It is still customary in London and its vicinity for the boys to dress up an image of the infamous conspirator Guy Fawkes, holding in one hand a dark lantern and in the other a bundle of matches, and to carry it about the streets begging money in these words: 'Pray, remember Guy Fawkes.'" He continues, "In the evening there are bonfires, and these frightful figures are burnt in the midst of them." John writes it as a statement, but it would most likely have been a question. Pray being a petition, they were effectively saying, "Please, remember Guy Fawkes?" Which is an interesting way of saying, "Please, can you spare some money?" But they had gone to the trouble of creating a guy, and now they were using it as a prop to hopefully draw attention to themselves and fill their pockets with a little money. And it was indeed the poorer children for whom this activity became a yearly tradition. By the time we get to the 1930s, this phrase has turned into something that many of us will recognise: penny for the Guy. Or, as I'm sure they used to say it, "Penny for the Guy, sir? Excuse me, miss, can you spare a penny for the Guy?" Now, obviously times have changed a great deal since 1605. Attitudes have changed, there's more religious tolerance, at least for the most part anyway, and Bonfire Night has become more about a celebration of life than a celebration of a foiled plot to overthrow a king and his government. As I was working on this video, I posted a poll on my YouTube channel. I wanted to know how many of my viewers have seen an effigy of a guy being burnt on a bonfire on or around the 5th of November in recent years. The results show that 49% of those who took part reported that there was no guy burnt on the bonfire celebration they attended. 6% said that something similar was burnt, and 10% said they couldn't get close enough. Only 36% said there was a guy. I did the same thing on my Instagram account. And interestingly, the amount of people who voted that there definitely wasn't a guy on the bonfire was much higher this time. However, only 28 people took part on Instagram. And I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everyone that did take part either on Instagram or on YouTube. Now, obviously for those who couldn't get close enough to see, we're not going to know whether there was a guy or not. But I'd be interested to know about your experience. Do you still see a guy on the bonfire? Do you place him there? What do you make of the history I've just shared with you? Are you pleased things are changing, or do you grieve for a tradition that appears to be burning on its own bonfire? Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. For I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.